I've always been fascinated by the unknown. There's something about the allure of uncharted territory, a world where reality blurs with the fantastical. It was this very fascination that led me to join a small but dedicated group of cryptid hunters. For years, we'd chased rumors, stories, and strange sightings across the country, hoping to stumble upon definitive proof that the creatures everyone whispered about in hushed tones really existed. Looking back, the excitement of the hunt was often overshadowed by the realization that some mysteries are better left unsolved. I learned this the hard way during one of our last expeditions, which against every instinct should have been the end of my career as a cryptid hunter. It all started with a tip from a local researcher in a small town nestled in the Ozarks. There were reports of strange creatures moving through the forest at night. People spoke of glowing eyes, hulking figures, and a sense of dread that accompanied anyone who ventured too far into the woods. Most dismissed the reports as the result of overactive imaginations, but this was exactly the kind of lead that got the adrenaline pumping. We couldn't resist. The group consisted of 3 other seasoned hunters and me. We set out on what we thought would be a routine investigation. The plan was simple: hike into the heart of the forest, set up cameras, take measurements, and spend the night waiting. We didn't expect much more than a few blurry photos or faint audio recordings, the usual cryptid investigation fare. The first few hours were uneventful. We trekked through thick underbrush and dense trees, the sun beginning to set behind us. The forest had an eerie stillness to it, a quiet that made my skin prickle. Even the birds and insects had fallen silent, as though the woods were holding its breath, waiting for something. I wasn't sure if it was the stories or the atmosphere, but something felt wrong from the start. We set up camp near a small clearing with an old, abandoned shack at the edge of the woods. It looked like it had been left to rot for decades, its windows shattered and the roof caving in on itself. The perfect setting for a cryptid encounter, if you asked any of us. After setting up our equipment, we huddled around the campfire, sharing ghost stories and cryptid legends, anything to pass the time as we waited. As night fell, we started hearing things, distant rustlings, twigs snapping under heavy feet, and the occasional howl in the distance. At first, we thought it was just wildlife, the usual nocturnal creatures moving through the trees. But then the sounds began to grow closer, too close. My heartbeat quickened. I felt the hairs on the back of my neck stand on end. It wasn't until one of our team members, Rachel, whispered that she'd seen something move in the trees that things really began to shift. She wasn't one to get spooked easily. Rachel had been on more than a few high-stakes investigations, often taking the lead on tracking down cryptids. But the fear in her voice, the way she looked over her shoulder every few seconds, it was enough to make all of us on edge. We decided to head into the woods, cameras in hand, hoping to catch something on film. The flashlight beams cut through the dark, illuminating little more than the thick trunks of trees and the occasional swaying of the branches. As we moved deeper into the forest, the temperature dropped sharply. It was as if we had crossed some unseen threshold, where the air felt unnaturally cold and still. Suddenly, a strange noise broke the silence, a low, guttural growl so deep that it vibrated in my chest. It was nothing like any animal I had ever heard before. We all froze. I turned to look at Rachel, but she was already moving ahead, stepping cautiously toward the source of the noise. The rest of us followed, instinct taking over as curiosity pushed us forward. Then we saw it. The creature, if you could even call it that, was massive. It was tall, far too tall for anything natural, standing at least 10 feet in the air. Its form was hunched, shrouded in darkness, with glowing yellow eyes that seemed to pierce the blackness of the night. For a moment I couldn't breathe. It was like time itself had slowed down. The creature didn't move, just watched us with an intensity that made my skin crawl. I can't explain why I didn't turn and run immediately. Maybe it was the shock, or perhaps some primitive part of me hoped this was just an elaborate hoax. But before I could make a decision, the thing moved. It wasn't a slow, lumbering motion. It was fast, too fast for anything that size. The growl erupted again, followed by the sound of branches snapping as the creature charged. In a blur, we scattered, panic setting in. The next few minutes are a blur. I remember stumbling through the underbrush, my heart hammering in my chest, the sound of heavy footsteps echoing in the woods behind me. It wasn't long before I realized I was alone. The others were gone, swallowed by the darkness. I found myself running in circles, desperately trying to find the trail or the camp, but the woods seemed to shift and twist around me. The trees no longer looked familiar, the ground uneven and treacherous. I called out for my teammates, but my voice was swallowed by the dense forest, absorbed into the night. And then, just when I thought I couldn't take any more, I heard something else, the unmistakable sound of footsteps approaching from behind. I turned around, heart in my throat, but there was nothing there. The creature had disappeared. When I finally stumbled back into the clearing, I found Rachel standing by the fire, her face pale and her hands shaking. The others weren't with her. In fact, there was no sign of the rest of the team. They had vanished. No one knew what had happened to them, but I couldn't shake the feeling that the creature wasn't done with us. We left the forest that night, abandoning everything we had set up. The investigation was a failure, but in many ways it was also the end of something much bigger. The cryptid hunters that had once been fearless in our pursuit of the unknown were no longer the same. To this day, I don't know what happened to the rest of the team. I never saw Rachel again after that night. I don't know if she made it out of those woods or if the creature took her. What I do know is that whatever we encountered in the Ozarks was not of this world. It was something far darker, far older, and far more terrifying than anything we had prepared for. I quit the cryptid hunting life after that night. The woods had taken something from me, something I could never get back, and some mysteries I've learned are better left undisturbed. I've been involved in cryptid hunting for years, seeking out stories that blur the lines between myth and reality. What I didn't expect, though, was to be part of a story that became a warning for others who ventured into the unknown. It was a late spring evening when we set out for what was supposed to be a routine investigation, a trip into the dense woods of the Appalachians. For weeks we'd been hearing rumors from locals about something unusual, sightings of a creature not unlike the infamous Mokele-mbia. They described it as something that lurked in the shadows of the mountains, moving with an eerie quietness that could only be felt, not seen. There were no real sightings, just strange disappearances, whispers, and tracks that were far too large and far too loud, too abnormal to belong to any known creature. Yet these stories were enough to catch the attention of my team. Our group consisted of 3 seasoned cryptid hunters: Jared, who had been hunting cryptids for over a decade; Lisa, a wildlife biologist whose expertise was in tracking and identifying animal signs; and myself, a former journalist turned enthusiast with a penchant for uncovering the obscure. We were well equipped for the task, each carrying the tools of our trade cameras, night vision goggles, thermal scopes, and of course plenty of recording equipment. We were expecting to capture evidence, whether it was footprints or strange sounds, but nothing prepared us for what we would eventually encounter. We arrived in the woods just as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting a muted orange glow across the tangled trees. The air was thick with the smell of damp earth and moss, the sounds of rustling leaves filling the otherwise tranquil evening. As we set up camp in a clearing near the edge of a deep ravine, Jared, as usual, was the most excited. He was the one who would be the first to set up cameras, not stopping to consider the possible risks, but I've learned to trust his instincts over the years. By nightfall, we were all settled around the campfire, speaking in low voices about the legend of the creature. The locals had given it several names, but the most common was the shadow beast. They described it as a massive creature, cloaked in darkness, with an unnerving ability to stay hidden in the shadows. Some claimed to have seen glowing eyes staring out from the underbrush, while others described hearing deep, rumbling growls emanating from the trees. Lisa had gone over the evidence we'd collected so far. The strange footprints found on the outskirts of town, a pair of unusually large claw marks left on a tree trunk, and most chilling of all, a local farmer's dog that had gone missing without a trace, leaving only its collar behind. As the fire flickered and the conversation quieted, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. It wasn't an overwhelming sensation, but more like a whisper just at the edge of awareness. We decided to split up for the night. Jared went off to check the cameras and set up some motion sensors near the ravine, while Lisa and I stayed behind, combing through the underbrush for tracks. As the hours passed, the air seemed to grow thicker, heavier. The forest was silent, a quiet so deep it almost felt suffocating. There were no distant calls of animals, no breeze moving through the trees, just an eerie stillness that felt unnatural. Suddenly Lisa froze, her eyes wide. She motioned for me to be quiet. My heart began to race as I followed her gaze. Across the clearing, just beyond the reach of our campfire's light, a figure appeared. It wasn't human, and it wasn't like any animal I had ever seen. It stood on two legs, its silhouette nearly blending into the shadows of the trees. At first I thought it might be a trick of the light, a shadow cast by the wind, but then it moved. Slowly, deliberately. I could feel my pulse pounding in my ears. My first instinct was to grab my camera, but before I could even move, it vanished into the darkness, leaving nothing but the soft rustle of leaves behind. Lisa whispered urgently, telling me to stay low. We both crouched in silence, waiting, trying to make sense of what we had just seen. But nothing came. The forest, once again, fell into an oppressive silence. We made our way back to the camp, where Jared had returned by then. He didn't seem alarmed at first, but after hearing our account of what we saw, his face changed. He'd set up his cameras around the ravine, but hadn't captured anything unusual. Still, something about the atmosphere felt off. The decision was made to push deeper into the woods, heading toward the ravine where the creature had supposedly been seen before. The night was now a dark abyss, and every rustling leaf, every snap of a twig, seemed amplified in the silence. I've never been one to back down from an investigation, but that night I couldn't help but feel a sense of dread, as if we were walking into a trap we couldn't escape. We followed the narrow trail that led down into the ravine, the only light provided by our flashlights in the dim glow of the stars above. I was on edge, my eyes darting back and forth, but there was no sign of the creature. We pressed on, making our way along the steep incline until we reached a small creek at the bottom of the ravine. The water ran cold and fast, flowing through the rocks and boulders, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. That's when it happened. A loud crack echoed through the woods, like something heavy breaking through the trees. We all froze, the sound coming from behind us. Without thinking, I turned, aiming my flashlight in that direction. What I saw was a blur of motion, a massive shadow, too fast to fully comprehend. It came at us with a force I couldn't describe, moving with an unnatural speed, as though it was toying with us. The sound of something large crashing through the brush was followed by a deep, guttural growl that seemed to reverberate in my bones. We didn't wait to investigate. We turned and ran, the terror in our chests making our limbs feel like lead. As we reached the edge of the ravine, we looked back, and that's when I saw it, glowing eyes watching us from the trees, reflecting our flashlights. I'm not sure how far we ran, but we didn't stop until we were back at the campsite. Our cameras had been left behind, our equipment scattered in our haste. We were shaken, each of us too terrified to speak for a long time. The worst part wasn't what we saw that night. It was the feeling, the sensation of being pursued, hunted by something that was never fully visible, only a presence that lingered, following us through the woods. That creature, the one we never fully saw, remained in the back of my mind long after we left those mountains behind. As the days passed, the adrenaline wore off, but the fear didn't. The event haunted me, and even as I sit here now, writing this account, I can still feel the weight of the shadows that followed us. My team never went back into those woods. The investigation that started as an opportunity for discovery ended as a cautionary tale. There are creatures out there that are better left undisturbed, entities that thrive in the shadows, unseen but ever present. I never saw the creature again. But that night, I learned something valuable. Some cryptids are best left in the dark, hidden away, where their secrets are safe and their presence unknown. And some things are meant to stay that way. Cryptid hunters are an interesting breed, people who seek out the mysteries that lie just beyond the reach of conventional science. It was supposed to be just another adventure, another investigation into the unknown, but it ended up becoming a nightmare we would never forget. I should have known better. But we were driven by the lure of discovery, the possibility of unveiling the truth behind something that seemed too extraordinary to exist. Our team consisted of 3 individuals: myself, a passionate cryptid investigator with a background in anthropology, Tony, an experienced tracker who could follow any trail, no matter how faint, and Mia, a biologist who specialized in rare and elusive species. We were all experienced in the field, each bringing our unique skills to the table. This time we were headed to the dense forests of the Pacific Northwest, a region notorious for cryptid sightings. The one that had piqued our interest this time was the skookum, a creature said to inhabit the remote wilderness of Washington state. Descriptions of it varied, but one thing was consistent: it was large, powerful, and terrifying. Reports of sightings had been circulating for years, but no one had ever captured concrete evidence. There were rumors of strange howls echoing through the woods, of enormous tracks left behind in the mud, and of people vanishing without a trace. The stories were compelling, but we had all been in this game long enough to know that stories alone wouldn't prove anything. We needed evidence. We spent days preparing, gathering our gear: cameras, thermal imaging equipment, night vision goggles, and a variety of other tools to record any potential sightings. We checked the weather forecast, plotted out our route, and ensured we were well prepared for the isolation of the wilderness. Our goal was clear: spend 3 days in the forest, set up a series of trail cameras, and see if we could capture any evidence of the skookum. The first day in the forest was peaceful enough. We hiked in during the morning, setting up camp near a creek deep in the heart of the wilderness. The area felt remote, untouched by civilization. There was no sound except for the gentle rustling of the wind through the trees and the occasional call of a bird. We set up our cameras along the trail, each one placed in strategic spots where we believed the creature might pass through. By nightfall, we were ready. We gathered around the fire, sharing stories and discussing the skookum's potential behavior. Mia, ever the skeptic, thought the creature might be a misidentified bear, though she acknowledged there were some unusual things reported about the creature. Tony, on the other hand, was all in, fully convinced that we were on the verge of discovering something extraordinary. As the night fell, we huddled around the fire, the forest eerily quiet. Our conversation died down as we began to listen to the sounds around us. That's when it started: soft noises from the tree line just beyond the reach of the firelight. It wasn't an animal sound, not something I recognized. It was like a low, guttural growl, almost like the sound of a bear, but deeper, more resonant. It sent a chill through my spine, and I could see that Tony and Mia were equally uneasy. We sat in silence for a while, waiting to hear more, but the sounds stopped as abruptly as they had started. Tony grabbed his flashlight and motioned for us to follow him. We had no intention of wandering into the woods at night, especially after hearing that strange sound, but the temptation was there. The hunt was in our blood, and we weren't about to back down from a potential sighting. We ventured into the forest, keeping our voices low and our steps quiet. The air felt thick, heavy, as though the forest itself was holding its breath. The moonlight filtered through the canopy above, casting eerie shadows on the ground. We moved cautiously, Tony leading the way with his flashlight, scanning the dark woods for any movement. Suddenly, there was a rustling from behind us, and we all spun around, heartbeats pounding in our chests. At first, we saw nothing, just the dense thicket of trees and underbrush. But then, there was a massive shape moving just at the edge of our vision. It was too large to be a deer, too heavy for any animal I had ever seen. For a moment I thought it might be a bear, but this was different. Its movements were too deliberate, too cautious. We all froze, barely daring to breathe as we watched the shadow move between the trees. The shape paused for a moment, as though it was aware of our presence. The hair on the back of my neck stood up. Then, it was gone, vanished into the woods without a trace. We stood there, in stunned silence, trying to process what we had just seen. Was it the skookum, or was it something else? We didn't stick around for long. We turned and quickly made our way back to camp, our minds racing with questions. The experience had rattled us, but there was no way we were leaving without investigating further. We knew the creature was close, and we weren't about to give up now. The next morning, we set out again, this time with more determination. We knew that something was out there, and we were going to find it. We checked our trail cameras and found nothing, which only added to the mystery. Whatever it was careful. It knew how to avoid detection, how to move through the forest without leaving a trace. It felt as though it was toying with us, leading us deeper into the wilderness. By the evening of our second day, we had covered a wide area of the forest, but still, there was no sign of the skookum. We were growing frustrated and exhausted, but Tony remained optimistic. He kept reminding us that we were getting closer, that the creature was just beyond our reach. That night, things took a darker turn. It started with a faint sound, almost like something scraping against the trees. But then it grew louder, more deliberate. I felt my heart rate spike as I realized what it was. It was coming toward us. Something massive was moving through the forest, and it was getting closer. We scrambled to grab our gear, but before we could react, the sound stopped. The silence was deafening. Then we heard it, the growl. It was closer now, and it wasn't alone. There were multiple growls, each one deeper and more menacing than the last. We huddled together, trying to make sense of what was happening. It wasn't just one creature. There were at least two, maybe more. We couldn't see them, but we could feel them surrounding us, closing in. The next moments were a blur. There were flashes of movement, shapes darting between the trees, shadows that seemed to shift and grow larger. It was impossible to tell what was happening, but we knew we had to get out of there. We grabbed our gear and made a break for it, running through the forest, barely able to see through the panic and fear. We didn't stop until we reached the trailhead, breathless and terrified. Whatever had been in those woods was still out there, waiting in the dark. We never did capture the evidence we came for. What we encountered that night, what we heard, what we felt, there was no explanation for it. We left the forest the next morning, exhausted and shaken, our cameras filled with nothing but the sounds of the forest. But in our minds, the memory of the growls, the shadows, and the terror would stay with us forever. Our investigation into the skookum ended there, but the question remains, was it really the skookum? Or something else, something even more dangerous, more elusive, and more terrifying than we could have imagined? The cryptid hunters I met were a unique group. Each had their reasons for pursuing the unknown, for seeking out the mysterious creatures that lurked just out of sight. There were whispers of Bigfoot sightings in the hills, tales of massive, unseen creatures that left their marks in the dirt but were never captured. But one story always stuck with me: the tragic end of an expedition into the heart of the Appalachian Mountains that no one truly understood until it was too late. The group had been preparing for months. The leader, Ethan, was a seasoned cryptid hunter with years of experience under his belt. He was the kind of person who believed the impossible wasn't just a challenge, it was an invitation. Alongside him were three others, each with a different skill set: Jess, a biologist who specialized in animal behavior; Mark, a former soldier with extensive survival training; and Rachel, a tech specialist who handled all the gadgets, from cameras to motion detectors. They had an unwavering confidence about them, each convinced that their journey would be a groundbreaking discovery. I had heard the rumors about the Appalachian Mountains, the ones that stretched for miles, a maze of trees and fog, where few ventured and fewer still came back unchanged. There was something deeply unsettling about the area, the way the wind would howl through the trees, the strange sounds that echoed in the night, and the sense of being watched. Some dismissed it as superstition, but those who had spent years in the field, like Ethan and his team, knew better. Their plan was simple. They would hike deep into the mountain range, set up camp in a remote valley, and wait for signs. Mark had already mapped out a series of locations where mysterious tracks had been spotted, and the team intended to spend several days in the area, hoping for the elusive creatures to make an appearance. They believed something big was out there, something that moved unseen but left traces of its presence. The first day went smoothly. The team set up camp at the edge of a dense forest, their tents tucked between tall trees, and spent the day scouring the area for evidence. Jess examined footprints in the mud, while Rachel set up cameras at strategic points. As night came quickly, the forest transformed into a world of shadows, the sounds of distant wildlife filling the air. I had been following the group's progress from a safe distance, documenting their journey as an observer. They kept in contact by radio, so I heard everything as it unfolded. It was on the second night that things began to feel. He reported that the air had grown unnaturally still, and the sounds of the forest seemed to fade, as though something large had stepped into the area and silenced everything around it. The temperature dropped sharply, making the team's breath visible in the cold night air. The tension was palpable, as they each tried to make sense of the silence. They thought it was just the weather at first, but then a strange sound echoed through the woods, something deep, guttural, and unlike any animal they knew. It was a growl, low and menacing, coming from the dark expanse of trees just beyond their camp. Jess and Rachel both described it as a vibration in their bones, an unsettling hum that made them freeze in place. Rachel suggested using the cameras to get a better view, and as she moved toward them, the hairs on the back of my neck stood up. I could hear them talking, their voices low, but there was something in their tone that made it clear they were unnerved. It wasn't long before they saw something on the monitor, a blurry shape moving just beyond the reach of the infrared lights. Ethan ordered them to be silent and wait, but the restlessness in their voices was palpable. What happened next unfolded with horrifying speed. A loud crash echoed from the forest, followed by the unmistakable sound of branches snapping. The trees were being disturbed, something large moving through the underbrush with terrifying force. Jess whispered something about an animal of massive size, and the sound of her voice trembled with fear. There was a frantic scramble. The sounds of feet shuffling, equipment being knocked over, and hurried breaths were all that could be heard over the radio. The night was thick with tension, and every passing second felt drawn out. The group was in a state of chaos, unsure whether to flee or hold their ground. As the growl grew louder, the sense of being surrounded by something enormous and hostile seemed to intensify. Suddenly, a deep, unnatural sound came through the radio, a crackling of static before Ethan's voice came through, barely audible but filled with urgency. The team was on edge, their every sense heightened, and they knew that whatever was out there wasn't just an animal. They had crossed paths with something much darker, something much more dangerous. The static worsened, and there was a moment where I couldn't hear anything. I stood frozen, unsure whether to move toward them or wait for their next transmission. And then the radio crackled once more, and what followed was the unmistakable sound of a struggle. The unmistakable sound of someone falling, the scramble of feet, and the echoing crash of tents being torn apart. I could feel my heart race as I waited, hoping for some sign that the group was still okay. The radio fell silent again, and then came a noise that will haunt me forever, a scream. A blood-curdling scream that cut through the radio, raw with terror. It was Rachel's scream. My hands trembled as I realized what was happening, and I felt a wave of panic wash over me. Was it too late? Could I do anything to help them? Before I could even process it, the radio went dead. There was nothing left but the deafening silence of the night. When the authorities arrived hours later, the camp had been abandoned. There were no signs of a struggle, no tracks, and no trace of the cryptid hunters. Only the remnants of their camp remained, the torn tents, broken equipment, and the eerie stillness that had settled over the area. No one could explain what had happened. The radio had gone silent, and the team had vanished without a trace. Local authorities didn't know what to make of it. Some suggested that the team had gotten lost, or that something else had happened. But the locals, the ones who had lived in the Appalachian region their whole lives, whispered a different story, one of creatures that roamed the mountain woods, unseen by human eyes, with an insatiable hunger for anything that dared enter their domain. I wasn't sure what to believe, but the fear that had gripped the team was something I could not ignore. The way the air had felt before the sounds began, the strange vibrations in their voices, it all pointed to something beyond natural explanation. I wondered what they had encountered, what they had come too close to. The echoes of their last moments haunted me, as did the thought that whatever had claimed them was still out there, waiting for the next group of cryptid hunters to come too close. Whatever happened to Ethan, Jess, Mark, and Rachel remains a mystery. The mountains of Appalachia have a way of swallowing things whole, of hiding the truth beneath layers of fog and trees. Perhaps the answer lies buried deep within those hills, but it's not one that anyone is likely to uncover. The forest doesn't give up its secrets easily, and some things are better left undisturbed.